Chapter 1, It's Finally Over. As I was swiftly whisked through the front gate to the Santa Clara County Jail, flocked by agents from the Department of Justice and other local law enforcement agencies, all that kept going through my mind was, it's finally over. The inevitable had finally happened. Everything from my past was finally catching up to me. The final stages of the inescapable fate that I had always known would someday catch up to me was now playing out and unfolding before me. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, but there was a surreal familiarity about the things that I saw and heard. The distinctive sound of constant ringing intake telephones, the pandemonium of correctional officers and nurses herding inmates through the intake process, the sight and repulsive odors of drunks and winos vomiting on the floors, and the disparateness and anguish that permeated in the air from all those who entered this dreadful place were all things that I had never wanted to see again. But I was here, back in the abyss, and it was real. The stinging reality of my situation was resigning. I felt subdued and despondent, but I knew I had to muster the mental strength of mind and readapt to these deplorable circumstances. I had been in this situation countless times over the years, but this time was different, and I knew it. I was eventually escorted through the doors into the central booking area by an entourage of agents, and kept under close observation as they walked me through the intake process. The excessive amount of supervision placed on me was disconcerting. It gave me an irritable and incensed feeling, as if I was being treated like a trophy. At the time, I was a big catch, but this wasn't the kind of attention I wanted. Without question, this was one of the darkest moments of my life. I knew I was in a lot of trouble and had probably just seen my last days of freedom. I was facing my third strike. I was the prime target of a multi-agency investigation that culminated over the last few months, and I knew I was being charged with multiple felonies. I'd been walking on eggshells for almost 10 years, trying to avoid putting myself in precarious situations that would land me my third strike. But this time, they caught me slipping, and I knew they had me. As I sat in the holding area surrounded by law enforcement officials, my mind drifted off to the only thing in this world that I cared about the most, my wife Vicky. I regretted not kissing her when I had the chance, just before they took me from my house. I wondered if that really was my last opportunity to ever touch her again. Would this be something I'd regret for the rest of my life? I wondered what she was doing and how all this was affecting her emotionally. Our house had just been raided, and I knew she'd be devastated. During the search, the officers promised me that they'd release her if I owned up and took responsibility for all the illegal contraband they found. Now I wondered if I had been duped into rendering a confession, only to find out that they hadn't let her go. I really didn't trust any of the cops to keep their promises, but at this point, I didn't have any other options willing to risk her getting caught up in my mess. I'd always promised Vicky that I would never allow her to be put in a situation where she would be involved in the criminal element I lived in. And this was a promise I intended to keep, no matter what. Even if it meant sacrificing myself and spending the rest of my life in prison, I just wasn't going to do that to her. My wife suffered from chronic systematic lupus that led to her severe heart complications, a terminal illness she struggled with for 20 years. She'd never been in trouble, and that's the way I wanted to keep it. I did not want her subjected to my indiscretions and just wanted her to be free from all this. Although she had an idea about the things I chose to be involved in and the type of lifestyle I lived, I took extra care to shield her from it. I kept that part of my life completely separate from our relationship. As I sat there thinking about her and what now looked to be a bleak future for us, I was still in a deep state of shock and reeling from everything that happened that morning. I couldn't believe that they actually kicked my door in, and they really got me. Vicky would later tell me that I was out there acting like I was untouchable, invincible. I guess I was, but I thought that I was on top of my game. I had taken great strides to insulate myself and was very selective of those I allowed to get close to me. I scrutinized everyone and everything I got myself involved with, but in the end, even this was not enough. I slipped up somewhere and was infiltrated. I kept replaying everything in my mind over and over, trying to identify who or what it was. Several possible scenarios came to mind, but nothing jumped out at me. Nothing registered. The only thing that kept coming back to mind was the images of my front door being smashed in and watching the whole scene unfold. The entry team that breached my door must have thought I was going to go out in a blaze of glory, since they obviously took extra precautions before raiding my house. They were dressed in full tactical gear, heavily armed with assault rifles, and they deployed an unnecessary amount of flash grenades. The night before, I had been up on my computer studying legal documents relating to the federal investigation surrounding the Nuestra Familia, and had fallen asleep on my futon. I was asleep in a room that I converted into an office. Suddenly, I was startled and awoken out of a dead sleep as a battering ram smashed my front door. The whole house literally vibrated every time it smashed into the door. I could hear every window in the house rattle and shake. I jumped up and made my way toward the front door. In my mind, there was only one of three things that could have been happening. Someone was trying to rob me, the NF generals had sent a few torpedoes to whack me, or the most likely scenario, someone had set me up and snitched on me about the drugs I had stashed in the house. I always knew that the latter was a very real possibility, and it would have taken one shady individual to bring me down. But I only lived in San Jose for less than a year and never thought it could happen that soon. When I finally made my way to the living room and the front door became visible, I could see that the whole area around the locking mechanism was smashed in, and there were pieces of the door all over my living room floor. One thing was definitely clear. Whatever or whoever it was that stood on the opposite side of the door was coming in, and I stood there ready to face it. If it was an NF hit squad, then I was only seconds away from facing my would-be assassins and a certain imminent death. I really didn't think there was any justified reason for the NF leadership to have me hit. But you could never be sure in this cutthroat lifestyle, because ill-motivated politics are always at the forefront and played in an underhanded and insidious fashion. If it was someone bold enough to rob me, then my fate probably would have been the same. My only real concern at that point was to do whatever I could do to protect my wife Vicky, who was still in the bedroom. Unfortunately, I stood there at the door unarmed and really in no position to defend myself other than with my bare hands. My mind told me to grab a knife from the kitchen and try to dispose of the drugs stashed in the house, but my legs wouldn't move and the element of surprise had caught me off guard. I didn't even have a gun in the house, but in retrospect, it's probably best I didn't. When the door finally did swing open, I got my first look at 10 to 15 law enforcement officers wearing full tactical gear, armed with assault weapons. I think they were just as surprised as I was to see me standing there. Instead of charging straight in, there was a brief pause before they all started yelling, "Get on the fucking ground!" But I was in a state of shock myself because I just stood there facing them, not really sure what to do. And I wasn't complying. I must have looked pretty foolish standing there, defying their verbal commands without a weapon against 15 members of San Jose's SWAT team. I didn't want them rushing in and scaring Vicky. In one of the police reports that documented their entry, it actually read that I took an aggressive stance and advanced towards them. But this was something I didn't remember. I'm fortunate they didn't use this as an excuse to take me out. By now, with all the commotion, I knew Vicky had to be up and was probably terrified of what was happening in the living room. Luckily, she stayed put and didn't come out of the bedroom. As I stood there refusing to comply and ignoring their commands to get on the ground, the police fired flash grenades which hit my legs. These were typical in police raids. The purpose was to disorient the occupants of the residence momentarily to gain those few critical seconds of advantage. You see these used all the time in the cops' television show. Personally, it didn't really have the intended effect because my adrenaline was pumping, but they were surprisingly loud. When I finally made my way to the front door, I was quickly grabbed, yanked outside, and wrestled to the ground. I was handcuffed and pinned down on the front lawn. Once I was secured, they really had no reason to charge in and frighten Vicky, and I told them this. After I stood up and walked back into the house, they led me to the living room and told me to sit on the couch. Vicky was walked out of the bedroom and told to sit next to me. I looked down and saw that Vicky had been secured with plastic wrist cuffs. This bothered me in the worst way imaginable. I told Vicky I'd never allow her to get caught up in my mess, and now she was sitting next to me, handcuffed and scared. The look of disappointment written all over her face spoke volumes, and I felt terrible. Once the house was secured, a sergeant from the Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, B&E, walked into the living room and said he was only there to execute entry, and the primary agency identified as the Santa Clara County Specialized Enforcement Team, SCT, would be arriving shortly to let me know more about why the house was being searched. When he walked away, I looked over at Vicky and could tell she was upset. The emotions were clearly mixed. She was scared and disappointed, but also mad and hurt. I'm sure Vicky knew I wasn't going to allow her to be dragged into this, but was sure she also knew that I was probably going to be gone forever. She looked back at me and asked if there was anything in the house. At first, I hesitated, but I wasn't going to lie to her. I reluctantly shook my head yes. She let out a small sigh and said, "I told you, Boxer, you should have listened to me, but you thought you were untouchable." She was right. There wasn't shit I could say about it either. I dropped the ball this time and I knew it. I didn't consider myself the flashy, flamboyant type, even though I had 4 new cars that were all tricked out, parked in the driveway, or the fact that I was living in a nice house, wearing the best name brand clothes, and always carried $3,000 or $4,000 cash in my pocket. I just didn't think I looked like a baller. Obviously, I was in denial. I drew a lot of attention to myself. I wasn't working a legitimate job. I was living way beyond my means, and I always kept my head cleanly shaven, exposing the large Nuestra Familia tattoo emblazoned across the back of my head. This wasn't something I really tripped on. I had openly exposed my status as an NF member for years, and I never cared about how other people perceived me. But for law enforcement, they obviously thought this was pretty brazen and that I was flaunting this in their face. I should have known better to do this in San Jose, especially with all the negative history and stigmas the NF has left behind. I guess I didn't care and never really worried about it. Why should I? I was off parole. I tried to stay legitimate, and I was out there in the streets, and I should be free to make whatever choices I saw fit since I was no longer state property. When I was sitting next to Vicky on the couch, it was the first time I noticed my legs were burnt pretty good. They were literally black. The flash grenades hit me in the legs, but I guess my adrenaline levels were so high that I didn't even feel it. They looked so bad I actually laughed. Within the next few minutes, the primary agency that oversaw this investigation had finally arrived and walked in. This was the first time I got a good look at Dan Livingston. This was his case, and he was the one who had targeted me. He was accompanied by other members of his team, but he was the only one who I spoke to. The SCT is a specialized unit comprised of various law enforcement agencies who work in an undercover capacity for 2 or 3 year intervals. These officers come from different departments, but all work in conjunction to target high-level narcotic trafficking, organized crime, and gang activity. Agent Livingston was the leading officer in this particular investigation, and he didn't waste any time introducing himself. He walked straight in the living room, told me who he was and why he was there. Initially, he said they were doing an NF sweep, and there were a number of other houses that were all being hit simultaneously. All these houses were supposed to be related to this same investigation. As he was walking, one of the merged team members walked in the living room holding a double-edged cane sword that was found in the back office. The fact it was double-edged made it illegal, and Livingston knew it. He told me, "You know, this alone is enough to get you 25 to life, right?" He obviously knew I was a 3-striker. I didn't respond. I just sat there. At the same time, another agent found 2 ounces of heroin in a pair of my pants. And another agent found about a half ounce in the kitchen. At that point, I knew it was all bad. They already had 2 felonies on me, but I knew the worst was still to come. I knew they were probably going to find some of the other things that would surely seal the deal. I had about 1.5 pounds of methamphetamine hidden in the garage. But the two things that worried me the most were a number of hot kites from NF leadership and a disk that was in the hard drive of my computer. The disk contained thousands of pages of court-sealed documents surrounding Operation Black Widow. These documents were obtained by a federal attorney and passed on to one of the NF generals, a defendant in the case. They were then smuggled out to me, where I was to keep it secured and put away in a safe place. These documents contained active informant lists, sealed affidavits, informants' statements, and federal memorandums, all of which related to the federal investigation. This wasn't something that just anyone could gain access to, and I knew this would blow the case wide open. As Livingston walked toward the back office, I looked over at Vicky and said, "I'm gone, baby. I think they got me this time, but I promise you, I'll make sure you don't get caught up in any of this." She looked back at me with tears in her eyes and said, "What am I going to do, Boxer? You promised me you would never leave me or get taken away from me like this." This was probably one of my lowest points because there was nothing I could say, and this was the first time that I couldn't assure her that everything would be okay. The only thing I could think of to say was, "It might not be that bad. They only found dope, so let's just see what happens." That was the only assurance I could give her, and even then, I knew there wasn't any truth to it at all. I was in trouble, and no matter what kind of felony it was enough to trigger a life sentence for someone like me, who they were gunning for, and were laying dead to catch slipping. There wouldn't be any breaks for this, and I knew it. When Livingston came back out of the office, he walked through the kitchen, out the sliding glass door to a wooden deck in the backyard, and motioned for me to come to him. As I approached, he said, "Look, Boxer, I don't have a hard-on for the NF. This ain't personal. I'm just a narcotics agent working on a dope case, and that's all this is about." I asked him what made him go after me, and he said, "You were an easy catch, and you were the best thing going." Someone had obviously set me up, but he didn't want to discuss that. When I pressed him about it, he just grinned and said, "Trust me, I know a lot about the regiment you've been running out here in San Jose, and I know that Pony's your second in command." I didn't admit or deny this. I responded, "Man, let my girl go. She ain't got nothing to do with this shit, and she don't know nothing about what I involved myself in. Everything you find is mine." He told me, "If you're willing to step up to the plate and fess up to everything we find, then I'll cut her loose." But I had to admit this in a taped statement. I told him, "If that's what it's going to take to let her go, then I'll do it. But I just want her cut loose." He asked me if they were going to find anything else in the house, and said it was my last chance to tell him. Otherwise, if they found anything else that I didn't tell them about, then he couldn't guarantee me Vicky wouldn't later be charged with it. "The minimum you're facing right now is 25 to life, but if you want to help yourself, I might be able to help you get the L knocked off so that you don't face a life sentence." I told him, "Just cut Vicky loose. She was the only thing I was worried about, and I just figured I'd take my chances and see how all this played out in court." He told me to think about it and that I'd have another opportunity again later if I changed my mind. As we talked, I noticed a guy wearing a three-piece suit walk out onto the back porch surveying the evidence. At the time, I assumed he was a Fed, but I later learned that he was actually the prosecuting attorney, District Attorney Lance Doherty, who would be handling my case. At the conclusion of our conversation, Livingston led me back into the living room where I was told to sit back down next to Vicky. We sat there for about another 20 minutes before they told me I'd be transported to a substation in Campbell. Prior to being escorted out of the house and to a patrol car, Vicky was led back into the bedroom by a female officer so she could put on sweatpants and shoes. I wanted her to be cut loose right there, but they said she'd had to be taken to the station and released from there after I gave a confession. As she was led back down the hallway, I was walked out of the front door. There was just a brief moment where we crossed paths, and I had a chance to tell her that I loved her and not to worry, that they'd be letting her go at the station. To this day, I solemnly regret not taking advantage of the opportunity to kiss her goodbye, because I had no idea how long I was going to be away from her or when I'd ever touch her again.